Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at another Genesis Apologetics video. This time they try to show that the fossil record better supports one single global flood rather than billions of years of evolution. And I must say I was excited when I saw a 16-minute video from them. I thought this would be fun. But as it turns out, this is the longer video that they have divided up and used as individual clips, some of which I've already responded to. So, not as fun as I was hoping, but let's take a look.
Is the fossil record really stacked in a way that proves life evolved on Earth over millions of unseen years?
Well, not so much proves as demonstrates, but essentially yes.
Or does the fossil record provide evidence that the world was covered by a massive flood in Noah's time just thousands of years ago?
Not in the slightest. The fossil record would have to be completely different than it is in order for it to have been the result of one single global flood.
Actually, the fossil record does not show increasingly complex life emerging over the millennia.
Really? So where are the complex creatures in the Precambrian strata? You know, that era that represents more than 80% of the geologic record? You'd think that if the fossil record didn't show organisms gradually increasing in complexity over time, that there would be something complex found in the oldest layers.
What it shows is a record of death in the order that the creatures were buried during the worldwide flood.
So your assertion here is that less complex creatures get buried first in floods? Is that right? And if that was one event, what caused all those different layers? Are you suggesting that one flood deposited dozens of layers and they were able to turn into rock, like solid rock, so rapidly that no creature has ever been found to be stuck between two layers? That flies in the face of everything we know about geology.
Think about it for a minute. Genesis 7 verse 11 says that the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were open.
Yes. Think about it for precisely 1 minute. Because if you think about it for any longer, you will come to realize that it's referring to the cosmology that's discussed in the Bible, which has this vast cosmic ocean containing the Earth as a kind of underwater snow globe type thing, complete with sun, moon, and stars. The fountains in the deep and windows in heaven allow water from outside this bubble to make their way into the bubble, causing massive flood. It's a completely ridiculous picture of the universe, which is described in several places in the Bible, but I'm sure I won't even find you trying to defend it. Those will be the parts of the Bible that are metaphorical, but why they are metaphorical and the flood is literal is beyond me.
Creating floods and tidal waves that were unimaginable. The Bible says the floodwaters increased upon the earth for 150 days until all the high hills under heaven were covered with over 20 feet of water.
And then after the flood, all of this new water just magically vanished back into the cosmic ocean that surrounds our little bubble. I wonder if Noah got hot floating that close to the sun.
This process successively buried all creatures outside the ark based on where they lived as the floodwaters prevailed, how smart they were, their means and speed of mobility, and their body density.
So, intelligence plays a role in how quickly you sink in a flood? Does that mean that bigger brains are more buoyant or something? Is that the claim? Or are you trying to suggest the reason we don't find humans in older layers of the geologic column is because they were smart enough to run up a hill in the flood? Because, yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, intelligence automatically means that no people lived in flat areas with no hills. Also, less intelligent animals that are completely unable to avoid flooding by doing things like, say, walking away from the flooding. And the partially intelligent animals stopped halfway up the hill because they couldn't figure out that going higher would be better. Yeah, sounds entirely plausible to me, sure.
This is precisely why the fossil record generally shows the shallow water marine creatures buried in the lower layers.
Okay, to start off here, I'm going to address the image that you just put up. The fossil record represents a record of death, not life emerging over millions of years. Those two items are not mutually exclusive. I mean, it's kind of self-evident that something needs to die in order to undergo the fossilization process, so naturally a record of dead bodies will be a record of death. The order in which those dead bodies appear in the fossil record points to the emergence of complex life over the span of billions of years. Now, as to the marine fossils being buried first, how come there are no complex marine fossils in the Precambrian layer? There have been plenty of bacteria fossils discovered in the Precambrian, but not one single trilobite or hallucigenia. Why?
Then, as the ocean waters rose higher and higher, the suffocated fish were buried.
So the fish were buried after the marine animals. Call me crazy, but I was under the impression that fish were marine animals. But that aside, if this were all one single event, wouldn't it be fairly common to find modern fish in Precambrian and Cambrian layers? It's not hard to see how an event as catastrophic as a global flood would mix up where fish would normally be swimming by pushing modern fish down to the bottom of the ocean and pulling the Cambrian specimens up closer to the surface. Why doesn't that happen?
Followed by amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and then birds.
So what mechanism kept everything so well sorted? What exactly caused the bacteria that we find in Precambrian layers to only be found in the Precambrian layers, and multicellular life to be found in the more recent layers? Why were all the creatures associated with the Cambrian explosion stuck in the Cambrian layers? Why was not a single animal ever seen to be struggling between layers? If it was laid down in one event, would it not be possible, in fact, would it not be common, that creatures would be partially buried in sediment, only to have the burial finish with the next batch of sediment deposits? And why were the sediment deposits so universal and even, like the iridium layer in the KPG boundary? Why would a global flood that stirs things up enough to carve the Grand Canyon in a few days be so peaceful as to allow the entire Earth to be covered by a layer of iridium at one time?
Dr. Carl Werner spent 17 years traveling to museums and dig sites around the globe, photographing thousands of original fossils and the actual fossil layers where they were found. His research revealed a lack of evidence for evolution theory, including no transitional fossils and clear evidence that shows animals have remained the same over the supposed millions of years of evolution.
From what I have read about Dr. Werner, basically his only argument seems to be that some animals haven't changed much over evolutionary time. This isn't a problem for evolution, as nothing in the theory says that every creature must change drastically over the course of time. If an animal is already a good fit for its environment, and its environment doesn't change much, there is no reason for that animal to change much. Also, most of his examples have undergone changes, but they look superficially similar at first glance, so he claims they haven't changed. He's also an MD, a medical doctor. His degree has nothing to do with paleontology.
We went to the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. We filmed at the Smithsonian, the American Museum of Natural History. We filmed at the Chicago Field Museum, all of the greatest museums of the world, basically, and photographed their fossil collections. Museum Victoria in Melbourne, the Natural Institute in Brussels. We filmed at the New Zealand Natural History Museum in Auckland, and the Redpath Museum in Montreal, Harvard Peabody Museum, the California Academy of Sciences, etc., etc. We went to 60 museums, and Debbie took 60,000 photographs.
Wow, you went to 60 museums. How impressive. It's very exciting for us to, listen to you list those 60 museums. You must be an expert on paleontology now, despite your degree not being in paleontology.
Wow. At the dinosaur dig sites, we found examples from every major animal phyla living today, buried with the dinosaurs, and these animals looked the same.
Looked the same as what? Phylum is pretty high up there on the taxonomic scale. I mean, to give you an idea, a T-Rex is in the same phylum, the chordates, as human beings. In fact, my pet fish is in the same phylum. So how in the world is finding a representative for every major phylum that looks superficially the same as its modern descendants evidence that the fossil record happened as one massive flood? I mean, there's bound to be a few for each phylum that haven't changed much. Sharks are a pretty good example for the chordates. Members of the Nematoda phylum all look superficially the same to me, and someone who doesn't study them, and several of the Echinodermata look pretty similar to their ancient ancestors. Sorry about the pronunciation there. Now, finding a member of a phylum that looks superficially the same as a similar member of the same phylum today isn't really that hard, and is, in fact, to be expected if the theory of evolution is true.
You started out not knowing if there would be any.
Zero.
And then you found them in every group in the same strata with the dinosaurs.
Yeah, and it's worse than that. Not only did we find this for animals, then for the plants, we found examples from every major plant division of plants living today, buried alongside the dinosaurs, fossilized, and they look the same as the modern plants.
But again, are the similarities superficial, or are they actually the same species? Plants also don't necessarily have to change. The fern in particular is known for being fairly stable throughout evolutionary time. Several plants reproduce by literally cloning themselves, so it makes perfect sense that some of those species have stayed pretty much the same as their ancestors.
So you photograph fossils from dig sites and museums, and you realize that modern animals live with dinosaurs. That seems too simple.
Because it is too simple. Creationism is all about oversimplifying the science that looks like it supports your position, while ignoring the mountains of scientific evidence against it.
You know, Don, there is a rule in science called the rule of simplicity, or parsimony, or Occam's razor, that says the simplest explanation for a series of problems is usually the correct explanation. So yes, it is very simple.
Occam's razor, put simply, is that if two competing hypotheses explain the data equally well, it would be best practice to choose the simpler of the two. Now, by simple, it does not mean the one that is simpler to state. It means the one that makes the fewest assumptions. The theory of evolution explains the fossil record with very few assumptions. If evolution were true, we'd expect to see simpler organisms in the older strata, which we do. We would expect to see complexity develop slowly over millions and billions of years, which we do. We would expect that the fossil record would be particularly spotty before the evolution of hard shells and bones, and it is. These are not assumptions. These are the data, and evolution explains the data perfectly. Now, in order for the fossil record to be the result of one giant flood, you have to assume that a god exists. That you have to assume that it's the God of the Bible, that the flood deposits work in a completely different way 4,000 years ago than they do today, and that some mysterious force kept the more complex animals in the top layers of the flood deposits and the simpler ones in the bottom layers. And this is only scratching the surface of all the assumptions that you'd have to make in order for creationism to be correct. So yes, saying God did it sounds a lot simpler than trying to explain the evolutionary theory, but it actually requires quite a few more assumptions than evolution does, and is therefore not the simpler of the two hypotheses.
I love this phrase, simply profound. What you have found is profound by its simplicity. That here are these animals that are just like they are today, and they were there then, therefore evolution didn't happen.
Some animals didn't change much. That doesn't mean that evolution didn't happen. It just means that some animals didn't change much. And as I pointed out, that is actually to be expected with evolution.
Look what he found about bats.
Scientists have found over 1,000 fossil bats. Now, some of these fossils are beautifully preserved, full fossils of bats, even showing the wing membranes, the gut contents, etc. If evolution is true, you would expect to find not only bats, but a ground mammal similar to a mouse slowly changing over millions of years into a bat.
Interestingly enough, when I Googled evolution of bats, the first article I found from The Guardian had that very same picture of a bat fossil that you are using in your presentation. The difference being that instead of saying they look superficially similar, they were pointing out the very significant differences that show it to be a transition between modern bats and their non-flying ancestors. For one, it has claws on all 5 of its fingers. Modern bats only have 1 or 2. It has very different limb proportions from modern bats, with longer hind legs and shorter forearms. And also, probably most important, it doesn't have the enlarged ear bones required for echolocation in modern bats. So pretty clearly a bat ancestor that hadn't quite developed all the characteristics of modern bats, but looks superficially similar enough for your average layperson to say, yup, that's a bat.
There should be many, many steps. If you find 1,000 bats, you would expect to find thousands and thousands of each of these steps.
No, you really wouldn't. Fossilization is incredibly rare. The fact that we have as many transitional fossils as we do is quite frankly amazing. We would not expect a complete record for any species.
And how many have been found? 0.
0, he says, as he prominently displays a picture of one of the transitional bats.
No ancestors for bats.
Wow. Over 1,000 bats in museums and not a single transitionary fossil leading to bats.
Well, considering the one that he showed in his own presentation was in fact a transition leading to bats, I have my doubts about the claim that all the 1,000 bat fossils that he supposedly examined were the same as modern-day bats. Yes, the evolution of bat flight is not well documented in the fossil record, but there are so many others that are well documented that it's just plain silly to throw out evolution simply because you don't know the exact lineage of bats.
They just show up, completely formed. Wouldn't you expect that after uncovering over 1,000 bats, that at least a few pre-bats would be found?
Yeah, well, some of them were, and one was in your own video. Just because you ignore it doesn't mean it goes away.
The same has been said by evolutionists for several other creatures. Leading dinosaur expert Dr. Weishampel wrote this about dinosaur ancestors. For my reading of the fossil record of dinosaurs, no direct ancestors have been discovered for any dinosaur species. Alas, my list of dinosaurian ancestors is an empty one.
So is this a variation on the argument from "we don't know, therefore God," also known as the God of the Gaps? Now, that being said, the archosaurs are the most likely current known candidate for the ancestor of the dinosaurs, so it's not like that's just this big, huge, empty void where, like, we're just throwing our hands up going, "We don't know!"
Wow, it's almost like a divine designer just put them here, all fully formed. Just like the Bible says.
Yeah, but only if you ignore the piles and piles of evidence pointing to evolution from a common ancestor.
Consider pterosaurs, massive flying reptiles with wingspans sometimes over 40 feet that could likely only fly in the pre-flood world.
What conditions exactly did the pre-flood world have that would have allowed them to fly that the post-flood world did not? Did the pre-flood world have greater air density? Was there less gravity? Did aerodynamics work differently? You can't just assert that it would only have been able to fly pre-flood and then not explain why. Also, I couldn't find the news item that you had screen capped in your video. It seems to not be up anymore, but I did find a forum discussion about it, and it seems that basically they didn't say that it can't fly, only that they would have to run down a hill to get enough lift to fly, a technique used by the modern-day albatross. So basically your argument here seems to be, this clickbait article title seems to support my position, therefore this pterodactyl could have flown in a pre-flood world. Makes a lot of sense. Great. Thanks. Thanks for that. Enlightening. That's what it is. It's very enlightening.
Dr. Viol, curator of the famous Jura Museum in Germany, said,
Yes, I must say we know only little about the evolution of pterosaurs. The ancestors are not known. When the pterosaurs first appear in the geological record, they were completely, they were perfect. They were perfect pterosaurs.
He is in no way saying that pterosaurs did not have ancestors, just that we haven't found any fossils of them. Still not a problem, considering how many evolutionary lines we do have the fossils for. Now, the rest of the Genesis Apologetics video is either a repeat of this whole "we don't know all the lineages, therefore evolution is wrong about the ones we do know" argument, or else it's a direct repeat of their other videos that I have already responded to. So that's it for this one. Remember to follow me on Twitter and support me on Patreon. See you next time!